It's a great pleasure and honor to introduce Saule Omarova. Brilliant theorist and policy analyst of our monetary and financial system. Professor Omarova, Saule is the Beth and Marc Goldberg Professor of Law at Cornell Law School. That's a school in a quiet corner of New York. But Saule came to Cornell via a very cosmopolitan route. So listen to this. Born in what is now West Kazakhstan Oblast, she graduated at the top of her class in Moscow State University. Came to the US, did a PhD at the University of Wisconsin in political science, a JD at Northwestern University. That's just the beginning. She then has taught in Lyon, Paris, Augsburg, Germany, Washington, D.C., Chapel Hill, Toronto. She has been, those are all different places, I believe, Chapel Hill. Chapel Hill, Toronto. She has been a research or policy fellow in Los Angeles, New York City, Washington, D.C., and Stanford. She has worked in the public sector for the Department of the Treasury. She has worked in the private sector for Davis Polk and Baker and McKenzie. We can speculate that her cosmopolitan experience has somehow affected her vision. What we know is that her vision is both broad and deep. It really is an amazing world. In the People's Ledger, Saule proposed a radical redesign of our monetary system. She conceptualized reform at the structural level. The central bank balance sheet reformed would include liabilities that would comprise digital bank accounts for all users, private as well as public, and the assets would transparently allocate credit, financing private lending by bank credit at the discount window, and financing public spending by holding securities issued by public instruments. The idea would rationalize and make transparent two activities: private intermediation of credit and public generation of credit, money creation. That's, of course, just a sample of her work you all know very well. Saule has, among other things, comprehensively mapped the franchise model of private banking. In still other work, she's transformed our understanding of banking history, recapturing the way the OCC expanded the role of banks to open up modern derivatives trading. That is to say, Saule has a lot to say and a lot to teach us. I'm never going to stop talking and turn it over to her.
Well, first of all, Chris, thank you so much for this incredibly kind introduction, perhaps too kind. It is my great privilege and an honor to be invited to share with you today, my dear friends and colleagues, some of my thoughts on how we can reconceive and reorient our system of money and finance as a democratic project. It's a tall order to speak to such an audience with such cumulative knowledge of the law, economics, history, philosophy, of all things money and finance. And, so instead of trying to dazzle you with some shiny new things, I thought I'd just try to take a step back and maybe think out loud about the big picture challenges and opportunities I see as critical to the future of democratic finance. Just like Chris said, those of you familiar with my work will no doubt recognize these themes. So my academic career began amid the global financial crisis of 2008, which explains the trajectory of my work. But even before the crisis broke, when I was still a diligent little Wall Street lawyer, elbows deep in high finance, financial sausage making, it was increasingly obvious to me that not all was well in our financial system. And there are serious structural dysfunctions in modern finance. I don't need to tell you too much about that. But the 2008 crisis and the subsequent attempts to learn and then unlearn its lessons, and the now decade-old digitization of money and finance, they all expose and in some ways exacerbate these dysfunctions. And we can spend an entire conference talking about these problems, but let me just name three big ones, right? So the first clear sign that our financial system is structurally unsound is the fact that it continues to grow increasingly unstable, unpredictable, and effectively ungovernable. In the post-2008 flurry of financial reforms, the hope was that by adding a layer of so-called macroprudential oversight to the existing, primarily microprudential regulatory toolkit, we would be able to prevent the dangerous accumulation of risk and leverage in the notorious shadow banking system and keep regulated banks out of risky speculative activities. Yet hardly anyone today can say that our banks are safe or that the era of speculative financial asset bubbles and busts is over. The second related sign of the deep structural imbalance in our financial system is the continuing and increasingly pronounced trend towards privatization of financial gain and control over economic activities, accompanied by socialization of the losses on the downside. So again, post-2008 reforms sought to restore the quote-unquote natural alignment of private market incentives with the public interest in a stable and efficient financial system. However, this equilibrium has proven to be elusive at best, and massive public support of ostensibly private markets has become a permanent feature of our financial system, whether in response to a global pandemic, a glitch in the bond market, or to a failure of several badly run regional banks. The expectation is that the federal government will prop up financial markets and shield financial market players from the full consequences of their own mistakes or misfortunes. Despite the immense energy and resources pouring into the sublime Basel Capital Accord or the ethereal bail-in resolution regime for financial institutions, the uncontrollable spread of public subsidies and the too big to fail phenomenon are still alive and well. And they're getting bigger and thornier as problems with the rise of digital platforms and other tech-driven shifts in financial markets. Finally, perhaps the most fundamental structural dysfunction in today's finance is the increasingly self-referential nature of the financial system, more and more visibly divorced from the needs of the productive economy and the ordinary people inhabiting it. Today's high finance is not really about channeling our collective resources into productive non-financial activities that are necessary to support the long-term growth and sustainable prosperity of the communities it's supposed to serve. Rather, it is about continuously synthesizing new tradable financial assets and scaling up secondary market trading. Neither the tradable assets nor the trading process itself need to serve any real economic purpose outside of pure financial speculation itself. Crypto assets certainly have exposed the utter absurdity of this logic, but the process itself has far deeper historical and structural roots. So there are multiple reasons behind the structural shifts: historical, legal, political, ideological, and so forth. And there's a rich literature on this subject, to which many of you have made and are continuing to make immensely important contributions. But for purposes of painting the big picture today, I think it's fair to say that the ultimate systemic cause of these pervasive and seemingly intractable financial sector problems is the deepening macro-level imbalance between public and private powers, roles, and responsibilities in finance. So one of the central ideas underlying and unifying my current scholarship is an understanding of our financial system as a particular kind of public-private partnership for the creation and distribution of sovereign credit money. This is what Chris has referred to earlier as this idea of finance franchise, which I cannot take full credit for it. Of course, my colleague, Cornell University colleague, Bob Hockett, was my co-author on this piece. But in this franchise-like arrangement, the sovereign public, acting primarily through the central bank, outsources critical public functions of money creation and credit allocation to specially chartered private financial actors, banks. And then the public also accommodates those private franchisee banks' privately issued deposit liabilities and guarantees their convertibility into sovereign currency. And this quasi-public status and the extraordinary public subsidy that comes with it are exactly what makes banks special. But it also fundamentally shapes the structure and relational dynamics of the broader financial system, not just banks. Because that system is attached to and supported by the publicly subsidized banking core. Though less commonly seen as such, our entire financial system is a public-private hybrid. In that system, private market actors retain control over substantive decisions on how to allocate financial capital to various uses, and thus hold the power to determine the overall volume and structure of financial claims in that system. The public, on the other hand, bears the responsibility for maintaining the overall stability of the financial system and ensuring its uninterrupted operation. The entire history of US financial markets and regulation since the New Deal era at least has been a history of continuous renegotiation and readjustment of this delicate public-private boundary. And in recent decades, the sphere of private power and control has grown immensely, while the public's footprint in the financial system has consistently decreased. And the rise of neoliberal ideology, of course, helped to justify and facilitate this systematic loss of public power and create the complex web of structural imbalances that we see in today's financial system. So all of this is basically a familiar story, right? But it does set the context for the really big and interesting question. And that question is, how can we address these fundamental structural dysfunctions of modern finance, the systemic instability, the abuses of public subsidies, and disconnect between finance and the real economy? So structural problems demand structural solutions. I think that much we can all agree upon. And these solutions need to be deliberately macro-systemic in focus. And they need to form a coherent strategy aiming to restore and strengthen the power and function of finance as a vital public resource. And this is crucial, the legitimate object of public action. To be successful, this strategy should include 3 functionally distinct but normatively unified layers, at least in my view. And I call these layers, let's call them, for the purposes of today's conversation, a regulatory reset, public participation, and my favorite, ready for it, industrial policy. So the first layer of this strategy is what I would call a regulatory reset. Financial regulation is the most immediate and visible tool of the change we need. It's the sphere where the government is actually seen as a legitimate actor protecting legitimate public interests. That's our first line of offense in that sense, right? So there are many ways in which the various aspects and areas of financial regulation can be improved, strengthened, and perhaps even overhauled to make very specific rules and mechanisms of regulation and supervision of financial institutions more effective in achieving certain goals of public policy. But there is more to be done. There is more that needs to be done in that respect. What we need is a deeper rethink of the regulatory philosophy, a more fundamental and deliberate shift in the underlying paradigm of what the individual regulatory schemes are aiming to achieve for our economy and our democracy. Financial regulation must unshackle itself from the tyranny of the micro. It must recognize the distinct nature of macro-level systemic risks and concerns and develop tools and approaches that target these concerns directly and independently, rather than by extension from the familiar micro-transactional realm. Regulators and policymakers need to approach finance as a form of economic and political power, and not as simply a politically neutral input in private economic enterprise. So taking a fresh look at the fundamental goals of US bank regulation offers one example of what that might entail. In a recent project co-authored with a long-time friend and colleague, Graham Steele, who's currently at the US Treasury Department, we set out to do just that by recovering the long-forgotten spirit of our existing banking law as an anti-monopoly scheme, a uniquely capacious form of what we call structural antitrust. So in the mainstream discourse, banking and antitrust are treated as 2 conceptually and normatively distinct areas of law and policy, with only a small area of overlap, primarily bank merger review. Bank regulation is typically understood as preoccupied nearly exclusively with banks' safety and soundness, their solvency, and prevention of depositor runs. In crisis situations, these considerations routinely trump any kind of anti-monopoly concerns and worries about excessive consolidation and concentration in the banking industry or the growth of too big to fail conglomerates. In fact, right now, the banking lobby is busy using the latest banking crisis to push for loosening of bank merger policy, and all of that is in the name of financial stability. We're used to that. But even in peacetime, many key provisions of US banking laws, for example, chartering requirements, restrictions on activities and affiliations and so forth, seem to reflect a deliberate choice in favor of financial stability and bank solvency at the expense of market competition or market structure more generally, right? A more careful analysis, however, reveals quite the opposite dynamics. It shows the hidden role of many familiar provisions of US banking law as important structural constraints on excessive concentrations of private power over the nation's money and credit, a vital public resource. While serving traditional safety and soundness goals, these laws and regulations are designed, each in its own way, to prevent private profit-seeking banks from abusing their privileged access to public subsidy and other structural advantages in a way that would skew allocation of credit and harm competition in the broader economy, not just inside the banking sector itself. In this sense, as our research shows, the existing banking law quietly embodies a stronger, more proactive and comprehensive structural paradigm of anti-monopoly, antitrust regulation. Rediscovering this once well understood spirit, broader political economic function of bank regulation is a crucial step toward the fundamental regulatory reset in its priorities, in attitudes, and even in vocabulary. By expanding the regulatory focus beyond the tailored technicalities of purely prudential oversight, it creates an opening for more effective and comprehensive responses to the biggest structural challenges in today's financial markets, from the old too big to fail conundrum to the new dilemmas of the crypto era. Ultimately, however, even the smartest and most aggressive financial regulation and supervision have their limitations. That's why a successful rebalancing of the public-private power in finance requires deployment of a different reform strategy, which I call public participation. So this label is self-explanatory, and the logic behind it is quite simple. As the financial markets grow bigger, faster, more opaque, interconnected, and technocentric, they increasingly stress and push the existing regulatory capacity beyond its limits. Digitization, tokenization, and growth of crypto finance present a particularly tough set of challenges in this respect. In a frictionless, borderless, and fluid transactional space, socially harmful speculation and generation of systemic risks is also frictionless, borderless, and fluid, So the hyper-fast and super scalable virtual market in which financial decision-making is automated, compressed, and cued off simple, quantifiable signals is structurally vulnerable to extremely violent and sudden, potentially instantaneous asset price fluctuations, and therefore crisis. This shift in market dynamics magnifies the systemic role of central banks and other public instrumentalities charged with ensuring financial stability. It heightens the need for public market-making entities that are fully capable of taking instantaneous and decisive counter-cyclical action on a truly market-wide scale. As a practical matter, that means preemptive, continuous action directly within financial markets. It means that public entities cannot be simply regulators and enforcers of rules anymore. They must also be financial service providers of last resort. Yet public participation in financial markets need not be simply the means of protecting private players from their own greed and subsidizing their risk-taking. We already have plenty of that type of public participation, and both Wall Street and crypto lobby would love to see more of it. What we need instead are new forms of public market making and provisioning that serve the fundamental public need for safe, reliable, and equitable access to money and credit. Guaranteeing such access is the key responsibility of a democratic government. It's the background condition for individual citizens' membership and participation in an exchange-based economy. So CBDC, or central bank digital currency, is one particularly topical and salient examples of what this new kind of public participation could look like. As fully sovereign money in digital form, CBDC offers a public option for digital payments, a critically important function in today's world of proliferating private digital currencies. But it's much more than simply a form of payment option. CBDC is and should be the foundation of a new, more democratic and efficient financial ecosystem. In addition to preserving the nation's monetary sovereignty, it can actually help to eliminate or at least significantly reduce the underlying structural drivers of persistent systemic instability and reconnect financial markets with the needs of the productive economy. Realizing this transformative potential, however, depends entirely on the design of the CBDC. Ironically, today's mainstream policy discussions in this realm are focused largely on how to minimize the ability of CBDC to upset the existing financial sector status quo. The principal concerns here are about potential loss of financial privacy, disintermediation of private banks, and the uncertain impact of the enlarged central bank footprint. The emerging consensus response to these concerns is to design CBDC as an intentionally weakened form of money with artificially limited functionalities or access. So sometimes I say this to my students that to me, that sort of a bit like using a samurai sword, right? To slice bread so we can save the kitchen knives for the battle. That's the approach, right? So I do agree that financial privacy is a real challenge in designing a truly democratic CBDC, for sure. But I see potential disintermediation of private banks and the growing financial footprint of the central bank, not so much as the dangerous downside of CBDC, but as a tremendous opportunity to correct some of the deepest dysfunctions, both in finance and the surrounding economy. So as I've argued in prior work, and I'm not alone in this, there are many of you here who I know agree with me and have put out similar arguments in different work of their own. The digital dollar issued by the Fed and held in Fed accounts, which would be a direct, universally available retail CBDC, could help to eliminate multiple layers of competing private money, reduce the structural complexity of the financial system, and prevent potentially dangerous concentrations of power in the hands of large private techno-financial platforms. The vital function of public money creation would not need to be outsourced to private entities with an incentive to abuse it for profit. Without public subsidy and the intrusive oversight that comes with it, private banks, or formerly known as banks, financial institutions, and other financial entities would be free to seek out profitable investment opportunities subject to the true discipline of private markets. Having a meaningful public option for deposits could finally render bank bailouts a thing of the past. But just as importantly, the model of Fed accounts and CBDC that I advocate would enable greater and more effective public control over the system-wide allocation of capital. In this sense, changing the composition of the liability side of a central bank's balance sheet creates a tremendous opportunity to optimize its asset side as a lever of much-needed systemic change. It's difficult to overestimate the economic and political significance of unlocking the asset side allocative capacity of the Federal Reserve. Instead of being a back-end mechanism for socializing private losses, the Fed's entire balance sheet can be then restructured to operate as a dynamic public platform for both issuing fully sovereign and democratically controlled digital money and for channeling this monetary power into structurally balanced and sustainable economic development and growth. And the latter can be done both through the revamped and expanded discount window lending by the Fed to qualifying private lenders, which is really a form of national credit policy we're lacking, and through direct Fed investment in new asset classes issued by the existing and perhaps newly created public instrumentalities for purposes of financing critical public infrastructure and publicly beneficial projects. And that brings me to the last pillar of what I see as the new strategy of structural reform in finance, that's industrial policy. In the wake of the COVID pandemic, this once taboo term, industrial policy, has returned to the front pages of the mainstream media, but it's not yet commonly seen or discussed as an integral part of the financial sector reform. Finance, after all, is not the object of industrial policy, but merely its tool. It's the mediating layer that translates public funds into mostly private economic activities. That's sort of the industrial policy that we typically hear about, right? But to restore the healthy functioning of the financial system, it's critical to appreciate and optimize both legs of the two-way relationship between finance and the real economy. While financial market trends critically shape the composition and growth of the nation's economy, the economy is and should be the ultimate source of demand for financial capital. The economy is the client for finance, right? And it should take that role. Reinforcing that natural space, that natural role of productive economic enterprise in shaping the dynamics and structure of finance is an important means of correcting the financial system's own underlying dysfunctions. Reconnecting the increasingly virtual finance with the stubbornly real economy, however, requires a long-term approach, and that approach needs to be anchored in a sustained public investment strategy and a dedicated institutional platform for implementing it. So you probably already understand where I'm going with this, right? Do I even need to say the National Investment Authority? So the proposal to establish a National Investment Authority, or NIA, basically illustrates the transformative potential of this type of an institutional reform. I envision the NIA as a new federal instrumentality charged with devising and implementing a comprehensive strategy of economic growth and development. And this new entity would operate as a truly hybrid public-private actor, market actor, and not just being a typical lender or guarantor, but also an asset manager and a venture capital type investor. So reversing the traditional public-private partnership logic, it would actively channel private capital held by pension funds, insurance companies, university endowments, sovereign wealth funds, and other sort of long-term institutional investors into the coordinated construction and maintenance of large-scale growth-boosting infrastructures in the economy. Through creative use of advanced financial engineering, the proposed NIA could help these private investors to overcome the collective action problems that currently hinder investment in this type of long-term infrastructure development. This basically can also help to close that green finance gap that we've discussed and heard about earlier at this conference. That actually would be a huge part of this type of a new industrial policy. So as much as I love talking about the details of the NIA proposal, for today's purposes, the key point is actually quite simple. It's that this new agent of industrial policy would also act as an endogenous financial market stabilizer. By offering private institutional investors a flexible, new, safe asset class, the NIA could diffuse potentially destabilizing demand for privately issued substitutes and channel that demand into non-speculative, longer-term productive investment. And the very availability of this new asset class can significantly alter the dynamics of contemporary financial markets. By draining large institutional investors' demand away from risky and more speculative assets, the NIA could dissipate, at least in part, a powerful structural incentive for private financial institutions to supply such risky assets. So in this sense, it would enable the long-term stability and resilience of the US financial system and blunt some of the key systemic factors that impede the ability of traditional regulatory solutions to deliver their intended results in practice. So all of these things have to operate together. In a holistic fashion, an effective structural rebalancing of the nation's real economy would also thus help to rebalance both structurally and functionally its financial system. And this seems like an appropriate note on which to conclude my remarks, and the key takeaway is quite simple. To democratize finance, we must make it structurally sound, and vice versa. There are many ways to approach this task, and I highlighted only some of them. And a lot of work awaits us all on this path, and I look forward to all of it alongside all of you. Thank you so much.
You stay there, we'll take some questions. How would you do this one?
I'll take them, just don't ask me to sing or dance for you. Because I will.
Yeah. Does this work? You can hear me? Thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation. On your last point, I want to connect it up to the previous panel, which talked about global money, which is in this current system we have the dollar, and the scope of democratizing finance and money in the United States. How do you square this with the global use of the dollar and making it sort of the Merlin presentation emphasized that there's market practice. Is it really a national currency still, or how do we square this sort of international use of the dollar with the domestic democratic space of the U.S. sovereignty? How would you think about this problem?
So this is, of course, the, I don't know, multi-quadrillion dollar question, right? Because it is hard enough to figure out, for example, what we need to do even domestically, right? And then when you add the international dimension to that problem, it becomes extremely difficult. And I'm the first to admit that I'm no Perry Merling, I'm not an expert in international finance to that effect. But one observation I would like to make is that some of these issues perhaps are nearly impossible to resolve in the abstract, sort of kind of until we start perhaps going about implementing some of these elements of structural reform domestically. Precisely because the international financial system, global finance, is so quick and so immensely reactive to whatever happens to the supply and the shape, right, and the structural composition of the US dollar-based system domestically. So I don't mean it as a cop-out. What I'm trying to say here is that sometimes perhaps we should start thinking about the problem that seems intractable because it's too complex from the perspective of kind of a dynamic, step-by-step kind of movement as we go about, because some of these solutions may present themselves at the point where we would have to take it at that point.
Thank you for your very comprehensive talk. There is a movement out right now. Is this working? Yeah. There is a movement out right now to establish a national infrastructure bank. I'm wondering if you are familiar along the lines of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation of yore. And I'm wondering if you're familiar with that movement and if you see it as compatible with what you're proposing here with the National Infrastructure Authority, I think you called it. Yeah, thank you.
Right, yes, of course. There are many proposals that have been put forward over the last several decades, including the National Infrastructure Bank proposal that is quite recent, yes. And I think all of these proposals are completely sympathetic with the concept of the NIA. Where the NIA goes an extra mile is adding to the capacity of the National Infrastructure Bank idea, right, in two ways. One is sort of adding to the ability to basically take some public money and kind of try to use that to lever up private investment in specific types of mostly physical infrastructure. One other function that NIA would have would be sort of the coordination and I hesitate to use the P word, planning, but I shall use it. The coordination and strategizing, let's say, on the national level with respect to what kind of structural imbalances, geographic imbalances, sectoral imbalances exist on a national scale, right? So that certain bottlenecks with the flow of credit or equity investment need to be resolved in that kind of comprehensive, coordinated fashion. And that creates this sort of an extra layer of institutional and governance design that none of the existing national infrastructure bank proposals that I'm aware of really contemplates. The second dimension along which the NIA differs from all of these other proposals is that it adds to the traditional toolkit of mostly grants and loans and perhaps co-investment, the minority co-investment with private investors in the building of roads or bridges or whatnot. It adds to that specifically and explicitly a much more proactive asset manager model of acting in the markets, and that has, to my knowledge, has not been part of any existing proposals. In other words, we don't need to be a minority co-investor and then basically leave the management of particular public infrastructure projects to the Goldman Sachs of the world or to some big funds, right? We can actually take the fund investors' money and have our own public entity. We can hire the same people that come out from Wharton and Kellogg or wherever and have them manage those funds, right? And that's where my allusion to financial engineering, and I don't need to go into that, comes into play. How to make that model that we don't have right now work potentially in the future. So I would say it's very sympathetic to the National Infrastructure Bank proposals, but it's more ambitious in those two dimensions.
Hi, thank you for the talk. My name is Michael Brennan. I work for the Federation of Worker Cooperatives, and I wanted to, given the conference is focused around money as a democratic medium, I was interested in focusing a little bit on the public participation side and thinking about where and when is like the democracy aspects of this proposal. I think the vision is very strong, obviously, and all the structural reform elements, but I think giving some texture to kind of where how we can see this facilitating a democratic culture, especially for thinking about through the rest of this conference, where we might see this as relevant to that. Thanks.
Well, again, this is an incredibly important but also very complex question, right? So how do you facilitate democratic culture by changing the structure of the central bank's balance sheet, right? And sort of overcoming or significantly revising the existing hybrid system, public-private system of finance, right? Basically making all the money creation explicitly public, right? The one way to facilitate democratic culture is by changing the material conditions under which the vast majority of ordinary Americans currently live, right? So this is the more direct and, perhaps it is Marxian approach to things. No comment, Senator. But it is an important and surprisingly frequently neglected aspect of how we democratize society, right? If we have an economy that doesn't depend on the whims of Elon Musk type billionaires, right, or some corporate board decisions with respect to how to maximize their shareholders' returns, if we don't depend on them so much for rebuilding our economic capacity, right, so that people in a variety of regions across the country actually can have jobs, they can be retrained, they can have networks of social services that would allow them actually to go to work and leave their kids, in daycare, for example, right? If we have those kinds of facilities and those kinds of economic resources directed toward those goals, then perhaps it would be much more difficult to dissipate the ability of that populace to speak its mind much more independently, right? That would be one way to think about it. But there are other ways to think about it too, because once you start changing the economic sort of or whatever, the balance of economic power, the balance of power in the financial system, right? You're changing the political economy in general. So a lot of the legislation, a lot of the legal shifts that we are witnessing or have been witnessing for in recent decades, right? They do come from the fact that the economic resources, the economic power and political power gets concentrated in this completely inequitable and oppressive way, right? So once you start changing of how money moves, who controls the money, and who has a say in where the money goes, then you could actually start changing the politics of it as well. And this is where, again, it's not that, by having CBDC issued in the form of direct Fed liability and held in Fed accounts, somehow tomorrow we'll wake up and we'll have this incredibly, true civic republican or whatever, true democratic society. But we can actually start hitting where it hurts those who are preventing that democracy from flourishing.
Yeah, I had a similar question, and so maybe it has the same answer. I love the talk, but I was wondering if there's a tension between a measure like CBDC that increases the power of the Fed and whether that enhances public participation. I guess it depends partly on whether you think the Fed is a democratic institution, and if the Fed, as some people I think would argue, is not particularly democratic, and if, especially with the role of reserve bank presidents, if it enhances the power of an undemocratic institution, and if we know, from the Supreme Court and many other examples that kind of people whose power are being threatened like to entrench themselves in government institutions, might it actually be a threat to public participation or create a site of countervailing power to public participation? I take it that the response is partly that if you do antitrust measures and if CBDC weakens the banks, and your previous answer that in fact it might be less of a threat is part of the answer. Anyway, that's my question.
So again, this is a complex or complicated question, right? Like what do we mean by saying a particular institution is a democratic institution versus this other institution is not a democratic institution, right? So there are many ways of, skinning that possum, I guess. It sort of, you could look at the internal governance, you could look at personalities and the tendency to stuff, this particular institution with a particular type of people with a particular pedigree, and they all basically, we know that, right? But there is another way of looking at the sort of, whether or not we can democratize the Fed by changing its balance sheet, right? By changing its functioning in very practical ways without necessarily changing its internal governance, right? And to me, I think, and I could be wrong with that, right? But to me, if we can use this inevitably bureaucratic, being an agency, right, institution that centralizes the power, and even more so under the CBDC proposal, right? But if the outcome of that is that now this institution is acting, whether or not each individual member of the Fed board truly has seen the light, right, and was reborn, but they're acting in a way that promotes our democratic value or our capacity as a society to then correct our non-democratic tendencies to the extent those tendencies may come from or be rooted in economic dysfunction and economic inequality, I will take that. And then we shall see where we go. Because the thing about democratizing the Fed in terms of its governance, and again, that's not what I've written about, so I defer to the experts. But the thing about it is that what makes the Fed so unique is that it's not just a federal agency and a public sort of government instrumentality, it actually is a market actor. And that's why we love it and why we hate it. We hate it because it acts as a market actor when our expectations of it are as, the political actor, right? We want it to be a political actor of a particular kind. But it's split inside. So that's the tension, I think, that needs further, tinkering with, and perhaps we have to come to terms with the complexities of that situation.
Can we take 2 questions at a time now, because there are quite a few people lined up? Sure.
Oh, excuse me. Well, thank you, Saule. It was a really fantastic talk. And
Who are you?
I'm Morgan Ricks, for those who don't know me. But it's really inspiring to see. It's not often you get to see someone. There's all these elements of your work that many of us are very familiar with, and to see you sort of tie them together into a coherent, integrated vision is really is really cool. My question's about structure, and structural problems need structural solutions, I think you said. And I want to ask the question on the regulatory or banking law side. What do we mean by structure? I mean, as I listen to you talk about that element of your vision, it sounded like a macroprudential regulatory approach, and there wasn't there. I wonder what exactly the key. Maybe I'm asking for one layer down on that set of issues. But much of what I learned about banking law, I learned from your scholarship.
Well, then we're done.
Right. But but sort of the New Deal system of banking law derived from the original National Bank Act that you're the foremost expert in, that we know that restrictions on affiliations that are quite strict, powers restrictions that are quite strict, restricting entry into issuing deposits and deposit substitutes in like a real way. Concentration limits, which go to part of the anti-monopoly tool, and so on and so forth. And to my mind, these things go together, right? Supervision only really works when you've restricted powers and restricted affiliations, right? Supervising and regulating these giant conglomerates just exceeds the power of even the most heroic regulators. And so I just. When I think about what I think about structural about banking law, I immediately go to that system that you've written about, and I just sort of wonder if that's what you have in mind when you talk about structure, or are you sort of cabining those questions to the side? Because to me they seem really central. Like specifically, what are we going to do structurally about the financial system on the regulatory side?
So Morgan, you're absolutely right. And this was actually the point of our new article with Graham Steele about banking and the antitrust, right? The point of that article was that, look, we already have a ton of ready structural tools built into our banking law and regulation that only need to be appreciated for this other side of what they can do, not just the prudential side, right? So once you look at, for example, restrictions on activities and affiliations as a purely safety and soundness measure, right? Then there is this suddenly the plane for discussion widens, right? Because then people can, or banks can argue, well, yeah, but if we are allowed to go into this new activity or affiliate with this new type of a company, right? Then we will diversify our balance sheet, we will diversify our sources of revenue, and we will actually enhance our safety and soundness. So it's a good thing from the prudential perspective. Let us do X, Y, Z. For example, let us get into digital payments or whatever it is, right? It's a good thing. But if you change your thinking, right, from just pure safety and soundness, insolvency prevention, that framing, into the more, what is the structure of the financial system? What is the structure, the division between the sort of the public power and private power in the financial system, and how it's kind of connected to the real economy? And you start thinking about it in terms of this big and, admittedly softer questions, right? But you create a context within which certain arguments that currently carry the day, time and time again, when it comes to specific decisions by bank regulators about certain banks or certain institutions being allowed to do certain things, suddenly those arguments would not carry as much power, because the plane on which the decision is being made by the regulators, right? The range of factors that are being taken into account is much broader, and you cannot win on just this one particular thing. So that would be kind of one thing. But for example, one example, right, would be with stablecoin regulations, like this big deal right now, right, or whatever. Everybody, we're all expecting some form of legislative action or whatnot, and we're looking at different regulatory approaches to stablecoins and crypto and whatnot. So right now, all of these most of these debates, at least in the policy world outside of academia, right, are focused on making stablecoins stable, safe as a means of payment in individual transactions, right? And that's the framing of the whole debate. But if you take this broader view of what would it do to the division and the balance of power, public and private power in the financial system, what would it do to the ability of the financial system, for example, to serve the kind of economic productive activity we want to serve, right? You shift your thinking toward that, and then you realize that we actually do have certain tools in our banking law toolkit, like affiliation restrictions, activity restrictions, and so on and so forth, right? So instead of pretending that this is some kind of a completely novel situation and we have to somehow make it safe, but otherwise it's something different from banking, why not then learn from the experience of the same kind of structural regulatory tools that were aiming originally at the same outcome, right? Basically prevent the excessive concentration of private power over the money and credit in the nation, which is a public resource. And we apply that thinking to how we regulate stablecoins. Suddenly, the same regulatory proposal might look very different, right? Suddenly then we start thinking about perhaps strengthening the affiliation restrictions, strengthening the activity restrictions, and maybe even taking into account the digital, the hyperfast, the malleability, the programmability of digital assets, right? Maybe we need to create yet stronger form of restrictions on affiliations or whatever it is, right? This is again, this is just to give you an example of what I mean by shifting this regulatory reset, shifting the priorities, shifting the vocabulary, and how that would actually lead potentially to very different regulatory outcomes on the ground. If that answers your question, Morgan. If it doesn't, bad luck.
Hi, Rowan. Great, nice to see you. Also, stranger. So I obviously really like the framing around this about public-private divide, and I think I don't want to narrow or reduce your vision of what you're trying to shift from private to public here. It's governance, it's logic, it's behavior, it's focus, all these resources. But I also wonder if there's, and again, I'm not sure if it's smaller or larger than what you're saying, if there's another way that when I think of public and private, I'm thinking of the economic logic of the investment itself in a way that, you know, the return on investment, the positive return on investment, the more prioritizing positive return over other social factors, right? Those kinds of questions, when I think of public versus private, that's kind of what the stakes are to me, right? Having something that's public that behaves with the logic of private finance isn't that much of a win to me. So I guess what you're seeing here, I know you position this between the monetary and fiscal authorities, and maybe the question is, where do you see the boundary here with this and fiscal policy, which maybe is a question of where do you see fiscal policy in this, but I guess, you know, where do you draw the line between things you think are suitable for this arena of debate and an arena of debate that takes return on investment in a nominal financial sense sort of off the table as a consideration at all? Because even if the government's in the driver's seat in your investment authority, it seems to me the interest of return on investment is still going to play some role in the decision making.
So yes and no, because, you know, first of all, the NIA, you know, being the industrial policy sort of infrastructure financing institution, would not or is not intended to supplant, to replace, right, direct public provisioning and direct fiscal policy and whatnot. What it is intended to do is to relieve some of that incredible pressure on the fiscal side that exists today, precisely because we don't have an institution that is in the middle that is between the Treasury and the Fed that is taking on some of these picking winners, or to steal one brilliant young scholar's upcoming book's title, losers. All that pressure that currently is, we kind of don't know where to put it, right? So we put it on the Fed, we put it on the Treasury, and we're kind of left in the middle. That would be taken up by this new hybrid actor, right? So I know that the NIA, yes, it is intended to act as an investor or as a manager for investors, right? It follows that logic. But the goals that it pursues, that part is not the same as sort of what market dictates. It's not about profits and returns, right? Now, the investors, the suppliers of private capital, through the NIA, of course, they are after returns. And this is where financial engineering comes in, right? This is where you actually can take, or at least I hope, you can take the capacity of the federal government, right, the source of sovereign money, to actually finance things before the real cash flows start flowing in from that investment, right? We can do it, we can bridge that gap. And what we need to do is embrace, I'm sure you would agree with me, right? Embrace that capacity. So in that sense, in the sense of how the NIA will actually produce some of the returns to some of the investors at certain times, right, to keep them in the game, right, to bridge that gap. And most importantly, the goals, the national developmental strategy that would guide all of these decisions. That's where the NIA absolutely must be a public actor, right? Now, once it starts kind of returning money to the institutional investors, to those pension funds or university endowments, whatnot, once they start seeing that, look, you can actually get a safe asset with decent return that is not going through a private equity fund into decimating industry somewhere in the Midwest, right? But actually goes into stuff that we all want to be built and we all enjoy using, then the hope is that slowly but surely, a lot of institutional investors would actually get weaned off of that sort of notion that in order to be successful as an institutional investor, as a fiduciary of whatever your beneficiaries are, right? The only way is to be this sort of dog that eats other dogs, right? And just like grab, and the only way you can make that money, you must play with Goldman Sachs and you must play with JP Morgan or BlackRock. Once they start seeing the actual alternatives to making money that way, right, then we might actually see the change in their mentality with respect to what kind of goals they consider legitimate within their financial mandates. But again, Ron, that's the best I can do to you. I mean, a lot of these questions are very difficult to answer precisely because these are all high-level plans, right? We don't have experience with a lot of these things. We cannot extrapolate from what we do today because the whole point of this proposal is to take bits and pieces of what we are doing today or what we used to do historically, right? But add to those pieces the stuff that we need and can't do today. So to the extent that I cannot supply all the answers, well, that's why we need another conference next year. All right.
Hi, Ronnie Hirsch, Haifa University. So I think probably most of my questions have been answered, so I'm just going to ask you to link them in a different way. So I'm interested in the question of democracy, and I guess, first of all, if you could kind of show us the kind of roadmap of how this reform might have effect on actually redistributing assets, redistributing wealth, redistributing the fruit from the financial system. That's one thing I'm curious about. And then the other is kind of where your position is on individuals kind of exposed to the financial market. Like, does this structural reform affect individuals who want to play the financial? I mean, because that has become this minor industry now of I guess tempting a lot of people to become investors. And I kind of wonder where that fits into this plan. And then I must say, with all the further questions about the National Investment Authority. I'm more confused on where it actually sits, but I guess the simplest way to put it is who sets the goals? Is it an independent bureaucracy like the Fed, or is it something that's a lot closer to Congress?
Yeah, no pressure, very simple questions. Well, so on the NIA question, I'm really glad you're asking these questions, but if you're really interested, I guess in March or February of last year, 2022, I wrote a white paper with Berggruen Institute about the National Investment Authority. It's sort of like legislative blueprint in a way, and there is a lot of design detail in there. And again, I think I have a sense of where your question is coming from, because with respect to decision making, this is one of the thorniest issues, right? How do you make sure that the governing board of this NIA, right, of this new entity, is basically developing this national developmental strategy truly with the interest of everybody in mind, rather than being influenced by various vested interests, right? And again, I cannot guarantee you that it would be the case, but then again, the entire democratic government is sort of based on our faith that somehow, through a variety of structural and functional checks and balances, we can get to where we want to go, right? So I would suggest that maybe take a look at that, because there are many moving parts to that proposal. For example, the structure matters quite a bit. In that structure, there has to be, for example, a network of regional offices, and it's important that there are certain, parts of the NIA that certain departments within the NIA, the staff, that is directly tasked with public outreach and community feedback, and making sure that there is that two-way communication process, because it's one thing to have some kind of design for a great industrial policy all up top, right? But not see how it actually plays out in the communities. So all of that is to the best of my ability is in that paper. On how the structural reform would affect everyday people, well, the finance affects all of us, whether or not we have money, whether or not we have any kind of understanding of how financial system works. So changing the fundamental incentives within the financial system, right, and creating this space for the public actors, right, even granted that right now the public instrumentalities we have, we may not trust them fully to really act as agents of the public the way we want them to be, but nevertheless, creating the space for the public market actors to really provide some of the publicly critical, significant financial services, right? Channeling those resources into certain fundamental activities that we all need to be undertaken. I think that will affect everybody. That will affect everybody. So again, I realize as I answer these questions that I sound like a very abstract, demiurge, right? It's like the architect of the universe. But, it's not that. But anyway.
We'll take one last question. Is that all right?
I can give you the last one. Okay, two quick questions. One, I'm curious about, do you actually care about structural soundness? You said that, and I wonder how you see it as opposed to risk management, because you never said risk management. You were very careful about that, I think. And I wonder if you are talking about public investments, whether structural soundness has to mean something different than, just like risk right now, because you're talking about long-term planning. So the second question is on planning, since you brought it up. I wonder if you quit the Communist Party or if they fired you.
Ouch, Mersa. Are we really gonna play that game?
The senator wants to know.
Who said it? Who wants to know? Okay, then. Well, risk management. Yeah, I'm not a big risk management person. It's like we have plenty of people doing risk management. They know how to do it. They're not the same people as are thinking about, how to make our economy and our society more democratic and more, productive, right? It's not their job. I think that we perhaps, and I wonder if you would agree with me, but perhaps the outsized emphasis on risk management, particularly on the micro level, right? But even on the macro level, what we really mean, what they really mean when they talk about macro level risk management is frequently just basically take the micro level risk management techniques and then just talk big, right? So perhaps the outsized emphasis on risk management is precisely a function of the fact that we have been neglecting the structural dysfunctions and imbalances for so long, right? Because structure is, it is precisely that, right? It determines the general conditions under which individual risks are being created or managed, right? So if the conditions are of a kind where certain types of high-level risks that, for example, exist in the shadow banking, and we've seen it in the run-up to 2008, or that currently exist maybe in the crypto sphere, right? Those kinds of risks would simply not be quite as attractive to private market participants because the structure of the system, there is no cheap money, there is no public subsidy that's uncontrolled, that's flowing through the Wall Street institutions or whatever it is, right? But there is some background condition that is enabling the accumulation of that risk today that will be missing in this new structure, right? Once that happens, perhaps the need to watch every institution's, every hedge fund's games might be less salient for us.
Like big dumb regulation versus.
Yes. Yeah, I'm all for dumb regulation, yeah, rather than way too smart.
Please join me in thanking them.